also be getting it.
Oh,
And
thanks.
what we'll see if we can attach it here even into on the chat box as well, the recording. Yeah, Ruchira, why don't you take over? Yeah.
No, welcome. Thanks, Sharmin. Uh, Sharmin has very kindly invited me to say a few words about ideas and Ishhet and this online talk series that we are getting together on history and methods in economics. In political economy, I should specify. Actually, that was a question that we got in my qualifying exam when we went on to, do our PhDs. What is the difference between economics and political economy? And of course, we all had many different things to say about it. Uh, and I of course said that the difference is entirely made up and so on, and it should be political economy, it shouldn't be economics at all, etc., etc. So all that. Nonetheless, so the purpose of our online talk series is to look back at the intellectual history of the discipline, try to understand how it has been constructed in the way that it has been constructed as we know it today, and also in some ways revive, some things that we in India are very interested in, like class, value and distribution. The questions that were there in classical political economy, which are slowly getting wiped out of economic syllabi. We've got this online talk series as a collaboration between Ideas and Ishhet. Ideas is, as most of us in JGU know, it's our interdisciplinary research incubator. And the idea of Ideas is that we will, do a lot of research on pedagogy, on economics, on trying to understand the Indian economy, which is also the name of the constellation that Sharvin and I belong to. And Ishhet is the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought. They are a very new society. They are, however, India's primary society working on the history of economic thought. So they want to facilitate workshops for teachers, try to include history of economic thought as part of curriculum. We have in our talk series until now, our inaugural talk was by Matthew Forstater of UMKC, where he talked about Lowe, Polanyi, Paula, and Pierce, and how we can try to look at the work of imagination in economics as the work of the poet as well as the mathematician. Today we have Keith, and I'm going to leave it to Sharmin to introduce him. And then we have two more talks coming in September. We have Manu Goswami on Keynes and the economics of the empire. This one is on 12th September. We will circulate our little circular soon. And then we have Prathama Banerjee on 26th September on decolonizing economics through the process of separation of the political and the economic and how to reunify them. Over to you, Sharmin.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Ruchira. And so we welcome everyone here, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Keith Strive here. And I think, if I'm correct, this would be possibly one of the first times that I think Keith would be addressing a primarily Indian audience. So I think it's even more exciting for us, and his work has really got a lot to contribute to to all those of us who are even interested in studying Indian economic thought, and especially how disciplinary evolvement has taken place. So I don't need to really. There's there's no real need to introduce Keith. I think a lot of people are quite aware of his work and contribution, but just to put it briefly, and what I find very interesting is that Keith started off as a sociologist and moved to the economics department, and then onto history as such, and of course also in the process becoming a professional translator. And so we have a lot of work on German economic discourse coming from Keith's like collected writings and all. And of course, more recently, we've also seen a new translation of Max Weber's Economy and Society, But for today, we are looking, Keith is going to be discussing some parts from his book, Constructing Economic Science, The Invention of a Discipline, 1850 to 1950, where and Keith has also shared some lecture notes with us. And at present, it should have been emailed to everyone who had registered formally for this talk. I'm currently having some difficulty in kind of uploading this onto a chat box. But the moment I can do that, you should also be able to access it through the Zoom chat box. And of course, and for everyone in the audience, you at the end of the talk and all, you would have a chance, of course, to present your questions to Keith via through the Q&A box as well. So anyway, with that, I'd like to now, hand the floor over to Keith.
Thanks so much, Sharmeen. And it is actually a great honor to be able to talk to you. I have given a lot of presentations on constructing economic science in the last few, well, since 22. What I've learned through the process is how people have understood this. And so what I'll try and present today are kind of reflections and emphases on the book, as well as talking about the book. And as I said in the notes that I circulated, I aim to talk for only about, well, not only, for 40 minutes. I'll hold myself to that. Then hopefully sort of stimulate some kind of discussion. And the reason that I circulated the notes, which I suggest in the first few lines, is that the book, obviously, some people find the book very, well, not Anglo, but basically very dense, because my whole approach is that it become more and more clear to me, is that I don't like telling, I like showing. So basically that I feel a lot of academic material, a lot of social science material is burdened by arguments about sort of where you've got your ideas from and whatever, which actually obstructs you getting to the point of what you're trying to do. And what I'm trying to do is to show how economics became the discipline with which we are familiar, and its origin in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that isn't an Anglo argument. The argument is because I'm talking about the discipline of economics, and I define the discipline of economics not as a body of thought, but as a practice, as something which is taught, which is to specialized students. And this form of specialization first occurred in Britain with the creation of the economics tripos in 1903 in Cambridge. And at that time, and I'll come back to this point, but at that time, there was a very broad, I mean, very extensive American work in economics. The American Economic Association had been formed. Harvard was particularly important. There were two leading journals, Journal of Political Economy and Quarterly Journal of Economics, which are still with us. But my argument is, broadly speaking, that at that time, although American economic writing, if you look at the journals, if you look at QJ and JP of that time, are very technical and in fact more advanced than the economic journal. There wasn't a discipline because basically, although you had specialized departments, you didn't have specialized teaching. There was no specialized degree. The American undergraduate degree was elective and dispersed, and I think that's a good thing, really. And the specialist teaching in economics first developed in the 1930s with graduate education, and that is really important. Now, that doesn't mean that there were no graduate economists. No, there were no graduate economists in America. In fact, one of the ironies that I've discovered in recent work I've been doing on the British corn laws and the grain regulation of the late 18th and early 19th century is that if you look at the literature on the corn laws in Britain, it turns out that most of the basic work was done by American graduate students in the 1920s. That the standard work on the corn laws is still Barnes's book, which was published in 1930. So in the interwar years, there were several works that came out. Also, Gilboy's work on wages, Rich's work on Norfolk farming, very, very solid pieces of work done by American graduate students who came to Britain and worked in the archives in the Public Record Office and whatnot, which at the time, nobody in Britain was doing. And this story goes on, actually, because the best work now that I've seen on what happens into economic administration in Britain in the 1820s and 1830s is in fact by an Australian. It's a Sydney PhD thesis from a couple of years ago. And she came to Britain and worked in the archives, and no British person has done that. And so, you know, this is also sort of an outward looking approach. I'll come back to that because I want to get ahead of myself. So this is a British story simply because my argument is that initially this movement for a discipline, in the way I describe it as a practice, starts in Britain, but it doesn't. That's only the beginning. It's only the beginning. And in fact, when I talk about the invention of a discipline, I'm referring to the invention, innovation, diffusion model of technological change. That is, that things are invented, but lots of things are invented and they never get anywhere. What happens following that is a process of innovation, and then if that innovation is successful, there is the process of diffusion. And my book is primarily about this initial process of invention, why there was this turn towards a particular kind of systemized economic knowledge, and then exactly how, describing in detail, in relentless detail, how this then got adopted in a concrete case in Britain. And of course, there were other things going on in Germany. There were lots of economists in universities, but there wasn't an economics degree the diploma, the 4-year diploma, until 1923. In France, there was lots of economic work going on, but there was no, as far as I can work out, no systematic economic qualification until after the Second World War, until the 1940s sometimes. So it's basically, and then in Sweden and lots of other places, so there were all these sorts of things. And so this is the idea of the point of the title. It says invention. It's basically invention and innovation. The diffusion part, which would be really the American story, I just can't cope with, because in my framework it's too large, too diverse for anyone in my position to do that. Although I do understand there are 1 or 2 people now working on that. But also, the other thing I would like to emphasize is that my book is, and that's what I raise in the notes, is that my book is continuous with where I started, actually. So Charmaine has rightly said I started off as a sociologist. Actually, my first degree was in sociology, but it was a very peculiar kind of sociology degree, not the sort of thing you would encounter today. I originally went to University of Essex because I wanted to do economics. In my first year, I signed up for the maths and computer science course, the computer programming course, but was very disappointed by the way that economics was taught, and very stimulated by the way that the economics and the sociology and government was taught. And so I shifted to sociology. But because I'd actually done a grounding, had this grounding in economics. Later on, I was able to make a switch. I went to Cambridge in '72 to study for postgraduate qualification, and I was in social and political sciences in Cambridge. At that time, it was the Social and Political Sciences Committee within the Faculty of Economics and Politics. But I was supervised by Maurice Dobb, so I was actually guided towards, I mean, the sense I had to fulfill kind of hard economic criteria. My external examiners were Phyllis Dean and Ronald Meek, two internationally renowned economists. So that was it was a historical thesis, but actually I was writing the thesis for economists. And my first book, Land, Labour, Economic Discourse, I introduced this idea of economic discourse to try and get across the idea that I wanted to get away from studying thought or theory, but that there were all kinds of ways of organizing talk about the economy, what we would recognize as the economy and economic activity. And as I described, my book attempts to open out this idea of how contemporaries understood the way in which economics worked, how their economies worked, and not to judge it by what came later, not to do this retrospective reading. Now, so my book is continuous with that insofar as constructing economic science, because what I do is I've turned, rather than actually say, well, there are lots of different kinds of economic discourse, and in a sense, we need to study them in their own terms. The question I raise really in my book is, how come we get this shift in the later 19th century towards a different kind of systematic knowledge of a different kind of economic discourse? And importantly, what I would also say is that modern economics that we know is just another form of economic discourse. There's no way that this is a master discourse, that we finally arrived at some kind of truth. This is just some kind of new evolution of the way that people have been talking about and writing about economic activity for, well, not millennia exactly, but actually certainly since the 16th to 17th century, and that's actually in Europe tied very much to the invention of printing and the fact that you can see, apart from talking about things, all sorts of people can start writing about stuff and print and circulating pamphlets and all that sort of thing. So that's really the time frame that I would think about. So I'm not talking about thought or theory. What I'm interested in is trying to explain why it is that we have come to end up with the kind of economic discourse we have, and what it is, and the kind of process by which that happened. And this kind of, I do outline some aspects of this in my in the first chapter in my book, but after that I just relentlessly go through the institutional organization. I say that it's very much about Cambridge, the first part of the book, but that's simply because Cambridge was a university, and it's a university which actually did the first kind of invention phase of this, and closely associated with Alfred Marshall, whose main concern was not to invent some kind of fancy theory. His main concern was to train students. His main idea was the idea that economics was important to teach in the sort of economics he had in mind in a university, because the way in which the labor market was developing, the way that modern economies were developing, you needed people both in public and private administration who understood the kind of analytical way of thinking about economics, who were trained in, as he said, warm hearts but cool heads. Basically people whose hearts were in the right place, who were interested in social issues, who were interested in reform and improvement, but who had an analytical approach which actually would get you there. Now, the point about Cambridge as well, I'm sort of leaping ahead a bit, is that in Cambridge, this idea, this analytical approach came from the maths tripos, because Cambridge was where there was the actual, everyone did maths, the maths tripos. It was a general degree. It was obsolete maths, but that didn't matter. And I'll talk about that in a while. But basically, Marshall came second in his year in mathematics to a physicist who, well, a man who eventually became a physicist who won Nobel Prize in the early 1900s. And so he was a very skilled mathematician in this sort of thing. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But coming back to this idea of a discipline, so that's what really Marshall got going. It's a practice which is embedded in an institution, the modern university, and it's about the communication of precepts, routines, to successive generations of students, who will in turn go away and teach other students, who will go away and do this work in places, whatever. And this was as I say, the sense of the Marshallian objective, which is very important. So central to all of this is the role of what I call the modern university. And so what I'll turn to now is to just talk about the way the book is structured, because the book starts properly with saying, well, what is the modern university? Why do we talk about modern university? Now, importantly, as I say in the notes, is that the older university, the pre-modern university, if you like, was vocational. We tend to think of universities as kind of, superior intellectual institutions. It's basically untrue. The medieval and early modern university was a purely vocational institution. In Germany, in particular, it was a state institution that in the German area in the 18th century, which I studied. They were state institutions, and the lecturer or the professors were public appointments. They were civil servants. They were paid by the state, and it was each large city would have, well, not each large city, but most cities had a university type institution, because they needed to train administrators and clerics and medics and teachers, and those were the four faculties of the classical university. That was so that the main function of the German university coming into the 19th century was really purely vocational. But on top of that, German universities began to develop much more elaborated sorts of ideas and across the board, I mean, in the humanities and the sciences. And by the late 19th century, the German university was a kind of the world-class leader, the model of what would happen. Now, just as a quick comparison, Cambridge is also a vocational university. Cambridge's function was to train clerics for the Church of England, which are either practicing clergy or teachers, basically. It's not, its function was not as an intellectual institution. It was a training institution. And so that's also important. There were only two universities in England at that time, Oxford and Cambridge. In Scotland, you had four, Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews and Aberdeen, which were actually much more like the continental model, because if you wanted to become a medic, you trained in a university, like Charles Darwin went to Edinburgh in the 1820s to train as a medic, or to train as a lawyer. You went to university. You didn't do that in Britain. So it's a different kind of model of training. So the point, the reason why, well, not the reason why, what happens is that this modern university is actually an American invention, because what happened in the late 19th century was you had a lot of American students who became interested in economics, but they couldn't study advanced at an advanced level in the American universities, partly because of this elective system. After this is all after the Civil War. Effectively, this is what happens. So what you have in you had this post-Civil War period from the late 1860s onwards in the United States, which is a big boom period. Loads of universities founded all over the place, but they're all kind of non-specialized and whatever. So people get interested in economics and they can't go anywhere. They can't come to Britain because there is no specialized university training. There's no doctorate or whatever. They can't go to France because France is a closed system. They can go to Germany because Germany has a doctorate. They can go for advanced studies. They can just go to a place and sign on to lectures because the system is open. And so very large numbers of Americans went to Germany in the later part of the 19th century because they were interested in studying economics. And so the two names, Seligman and Tausig, there are large numbers of them. There's been no systematic study of this, to my knowledge, which is a shame, but it's a very important part of American economics. Now, what happened with this was that a lot of them went there because they couldn't get graduate training in the States, and they got some of them did actually complete PhD theses, which was a much more limited thing than in Britain at this, than today. It was quite a short piece of work, but it was in an advanced piece of study, which was published. But there was a productive misunderstanding that the Americans had, that they saw this specialized form of knowledge and this role of the university, and wanted to impose this or develop this in the American context. Now, what happens in Germany was that it was non-specialized, really. The professor, this big professor, embodied the whole subject, and so and had a number of helpers who would help teach this subject. Most students, and that was advanced knowledge. Most students in Germany were what they called Brotstudenten, bread and butter students. They were just going through for the vocational training. But the Americans didn't really perceive this. They had their eye on, because they already had degrees, they were looking at more advanced type knowledge. And so what they did was they took what they saw as this German model of this idea of specialized knowledge, and then with others developed this idea of specialization, departmental specialization in the United States, where instead of having a professor who embodies all the knowledge of this subject, the knowledge is embodied in the department with individual specialists who develop their careers by advancing their own particular specialism. And so you get this in America. You do get by the 1890s departments of economics which have a number of different people who have different specialisms and who teach and write papers and so forth. But they're not teaching a specialized degree. And that's the difference with Britain. And that's why the modern university, I say that this feature of the modern university, which then is adopted in Britain. So, for example, the faculty structure in Cambridge is adopted in the 1920s. Up to then, you have that you talk about the maths tripos or the moral sciences tripos, or then later on the natural sciences tripos. You were kind of the organization of teaching was around exams not around faculties and departments. And that actually was then developed in the 1920s in Cambridge. So Cambridge followed on from all of that. So the first big point I make in the book is to introduce this idea of the university as an institution, which is the context within which a discipline will then be formed, because a discipline is a university kind of entity. And I follow that up then. The third chapter of the book looks at the media, the general media through which this kind of knowledge is diffused. I mean, before, in the process of formation. So I look at the way, and this has to be something you can describe it quickly, but obviously to actually show how it works, you have to do it in a particular context. So this is Britain, and you look at how, things like the British Association for the Advancement of Science and Section F with forms, and basically you get academics for the first time meeting annually and talking about economic matters in a local sort of organization. You get the development of adult and non-school education, which involves some part of economics. In London in the 1850s, you get the creation of the University of London, you get the creation of a BA, a Bachelor of Arts degree, which has an element of political economy in it. You get creation of textbooks to service this growing need. You get popular writings as well. You get the Banking Association develops exams which have a political economy element in it. You get from the 1860s onwards, you have an explosion of magazines or journals which are of general interest. And within these publications that economists publish, because there is no specialized publication for economists in Britain, unlike in Germany at the time, or in France actually, or in the States from the 1880s. And so you get, in Britain, the first thing that happens is you get the creation of an academic journal, the Economic Journal, which begins publication in 1891, and which is the vehicle. I mean, first of all, you get the British Economics Association in 1890, and the function of the British Economics Association, apart from republishing or reprinting old texts, its main function is to publish the EJ. Because this is meant to be a national journal, not one which belongs to a particular institution like the JPE or the QJE. That was a particular thing they wanted to avoid. So I first of all paint the picture of this kind of the university and the institutions internationally, and then in Britain. I do make allusions to what's going with the mediation stuff, the communication. I talk about other things because I published articles on international journals and on international associations and this sort of stuff as well, which I refer to, but I talk mainly about the British stuff. And that first section is then followed by a section on what I call the Cambridge moment, which then devotes 3 chapters to Cambridge. Now, as I note in the notes, the Hope essay, which I've responded to by Aslan Beghi and Oakes, they talk about the Cambridge tragedy of Cambridge economics. In fact, their review gets no further than halfway through the book. They don't discuss anything beyond Cambridge, and such is, I think, that this kind of hold the idea of Cambridge has over understanding the discipline of economics or economics in Britain. But actually, my story is completely different. I say, well, yes, it did start in Cambridge, and particular reasons for that. It didn't start in Oxford. It didn't start for particular reasons as well, which I go on and about in another chapter. But actually Cambridge, the model of training and education that was developed in Cambridge didn't travel. It didn't become, it was actually the LSE, which was a major vehicle through which this all happened. Cambridge was important, but Cambridge was the only place, because of its structure and the role of the Senate. Oxford basically had all these people who were interested in economics in the later 19th century, but the collegiate structure of teaching meant that you couldn't actually innovate a new degree in the way that you could in Cambridge by having arguments in Senate and then putting a thing forward and forming a new degree. And this process had been going on since the mid-19th century, when the moral sciences tripos had been created, which I talk about at length. I don't think anyone has actually described, apart from there's a thesis on it, has actually described or published a description of what the moral science tripos is about. But the crucial tripos was this, as I said, the maths tripos in Cambridge, which is what Marshall did and what Keynes did as well. But by the time Keynes did it, it had become a true mathematics degree rather than the older mathematics, which was really to do with just simply giving people tasks to do, to analyze and so forth. Because basically what happened with the maths tripos was the colleges didn't do any specialized teaching. And if you wanted to do well in the maths tripos, which you would go to a specialized private coach, like a tutor. And this is where the word coach comes from, because the coaching system of teaching in Cambridge from the 1840s onwards became very important, because these coaches would drive their teams of students in classes in the same way that a coachman drove the teams of horses. And this is the basic idea. And that then extended in Cambridge, because of the importance of rowing and walking and stuff and football, to rowing coaches and football coaches and so forth. That's where the idea comes from. So basically these were individuals whose livelihood depended upon the success of their students and getting more students. And they drilled these students in techniques which were then examined in a very exhausting, long exam period of several days. And the basic task was to learn these techniques, which you then would apply. You would have a problem and you had to spot which technique you fitted to which problem. And that was what the skill of doing well in the maths tripos was. Now, the moral sciences tripos, by contrast, was about reading books, and so entirely unsuited to the kind of training that Marshall had experienced himself. And this is the reason why Marshall sort of struggled for so long to detach the teaching of political economy away from moral sciences tripos. And so that's the important thing to understand. So basically, this ends up with placing economics in this process, the maths tripos with Marshall, all the arguments which we know about in the later 19th century, after he's appointed professor of political economy there, and eventually in 1903 creating a new specialized economics degree, which then develops as we know. This doesn't happen in Oxford for particular reasons. And what then happens is that because of the University of London, which I talk about also in my chapter on university, it's the University of London's degree had, in the later 1850s, started to be, you could start sitting and studying for it other than in London. You basically could sit it in Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham. Oh no, Birmingham, they didn't do it very much. But what happened was, in the later 19th century in Britain, you had a number of provincial universities established, new university colleges, the Victoria University, which involved Leeds and Liverpool and Manchester. And these institutions used the London degree. This is where Jevons started teaching. Used the London degree, which had a bit of political economy in it. But departments or teaching began to be focused more on commerce, because that was what people wanted. So banking and the law and languages and bookkeeping and all these kinds of things. This was what people wanted to study. This was where they could advance the study of economics. And Manchester is a particular example of this. From the early 1900s, the Faculty of Commerce was created. And in fact, the teachers who were appointed all were more or less all people we would regard as economists, roughly speaking, by contemporary standards, the full-time ones. But they taught mainly commercial students. That was the students, and that was so the commerce degree. So what happened, and it's especially clear in Manchester, from really the 1890s, you have the development of advanced teachers. I mean, Alfred Flux was a professor by the late 1890s in Manchester. He was a mathematician, a graduate from Cambridge, a student of Marshall and whatever, and he was professor. But mostly they founded a Faculty of Commerce, and mostly what they taught was what would be called commercial education, because that was where the demand was. So then actually the London School of Economics came along in 1896, and that was part of the same wave. So London School of Economics was like a London-based form of what was going on in Manchester and Liverpool. There's commercial education mainly, part-time, a lot of people doing railway clerks doing railway economics and part-time studies, civil servants doing part-time studies, so vocational stuff like that. And this was really what the LSE was about, actually to mid 20th century. That really most of the students, even though there had been the BSc Econ had been created in 1901, most of the students who studied the BSc Econ only did one course of economics, the basic course of economics. Most of them did economic history, social administration, politics. So that it was a broad degree, a social sciences degree, if you like, with very few specialists taking all the economic options that existed. So in the fourth part of the book, I explain or expand upon how this actually works in the LSE, that you get the development of all these ideas in the LSE and the training through the 1920s. And basically an emphasis on commercial education. The BCom was actually a late foundation of 1919, 1920 in the LSE, and that was actually there were many more students doing specialized commercial education than were doing specialized economic studies in the LSE. But what happens in the LSE is that by a series of accidents in the late 1920s, Lionel Robbins is, or 1929, he's appointed professor of economics, and he has this mission that he has a disdain really for commercial education, and he set out systematically, more or less, to what I call scientize economics. That he sought to make economics a scientific subject, and by scientific, what he primarily meant was something which was esoteric and not applied, and not and arcane, and not accessible to every person. And this was actually what he laid out in his inaugural lecture, which I analyze and contrasted with that of his predecessor. And so the final chapter, the final big chapter, is about what I call the scientization of economics, which is actually the way in which through this process, what happens is that in the LSE, during the 1930s, at the undergraduate level, my focus is purely on the undergraduate level, specialized training, a framework for specialized training of economics, which displaces that of Cambridge, is developed, and which, among other things, goes on to shape all the textbooks written in Britain up to the 1960s. So, and furthermore, the other thing I should say is that the LSE is central. Its exams are central to all of the other institutions in Britain apart from Oxbridge. And of course, it sits at the center of the British Empire. And so all of the institutions which are set up in, certainly in Australia and in part in India and elsewhere, are modeled on this kind of degree structure on London's what the London, because it's the social science faculty of the University of London, effectively. And you can also take social science, you can take University of London degrees externally. So individuals well into the 1950s and I think early 1960s were sitting as individual private persons degrees. So you could, anyone around the world could actually take a distance learning course with the LSE, with London. If they studied economics, they studied the economics syllabus of the LSE. And so this is a way in which this LSE syllabus transmitted around the world. Now, the basic problem, though, was that this happened in the 1930s in Britain. At the same time, in the United States, at last, graduate education in economics took off. And this is best outlined by Roger Backhouse in his book, in the first volume of his book on Samuelson, because he describes how Samuelson, as an undergraduate student in Chicago, sat in on a graduate seminar which had about 30 odd participants. And then he went to Harvard, and Roger reconstructs his training in Harvard. And you get this sense of this scale, so that basically somewhere like Harvard, they probably got as many graduate students of economics as there are more or less graduates outside London in economics in Britain at the same time. And so basically the British focus on undergraduate education, which continues really, it's a specialized education which has limited, well, economics had a limited appeal for public and private sector employers for a long time. It was only in the 1960s and 70s it started to become generally accepted as a proper qualification for anything. Whereas in the States, having a degree in economics, a graduate degree in economics from Harvard or Cambridge or Chicago, actually got you into the large number of teaching institutions that existed in the United States and then elsewhere in public administration. There was a lot of, and obviously through the New Deal, a lot of toing and froing between academia and public administration. And so basically, it was unfortunate for Britain that at the same time that this system got set up in Britain, at the same time in the United States, graduate education developed, which in the post-war world became really the dominating force. And that's really sort of where I finish. And so I've had my 40 minutes, so perhaps I should stop talking there.
Yeah, Thanks a lot, Keith. That was really interesting, and I mean, it was actually a really good, from what I can recall, also a really good summation of some of the key aspects of your book on constructing economic science. And in fact, some of the things you mentioned here also are ideas that struck me to some extent once. I don't know why I'm getting now only calls right now. Yeah. So what I was trying to, so in that sense, it's very interesting that you go into like, firstly, that the book is, as you mentioned in the beginning, I think it's very interesting that you're saying it's a deeply empirical work, and this aspect of showing rather than building, our arguments kind of through through specific positions rather on what was going on. I think that's a very interesting kind of approach as well, and in fact it also calls upon the reader to engage in a certain in a different kind of a closer reading, and to come up with one's own kind of interpretations of events, as you kind of mention it, so that idea. And I think it's a very useful way to study the economics, or rather history of economics as a thing, as a history of its practices through institutions, textbook writing, even something like faculty recruitment and faculty recruitment policies, which is something that, say, in the case of India, was very interesting and had its own kind of trajectory. And so anyway, taking on from there, of course, I'd like to also just mention it to the audience that please feel free to send in, write in your questions through the Q&A box that we have. And then, we will read it out and Keith can answer those questions. So please feel free to ask whatever you wish to get clarified, or any further inputs. So I have actually a few like comments and questions alongside that, and over here maybe I'd be pulling you back again into making some arguments rather than also just this like, of course, since we are if you're looking at these developments, say from an Indian South Asian context and all, and as you'd also mentioned, and we see that the universities, when they were first created in India, in 1857, they were modeled along the same lines as the University of London. The university was essentially as a supervising body, and collegiate education was a thing. So the idea being that ultimately just the university is a degree-giving body and just ensures that the colleges are maintaining the basic requirements of the curriculum. However, but along with that, I also want to kind of catch on to the word, since you're trying to premise something like economic discourse rather than economic thought, and we're trying to understand how knowledge, as it kind of permeates through institutions, and in a sense passing from one batch to another, and thereon from one generation to another. I'm also kind of just interested in asking that, since we look at the recent, say, histories of knowledge that are coming out, and the theorization around knowledge as a category itself, there is a lot that is being written about as to how the modern disciplines, especially like all the social sciences, kind of also really get shaped through the engagement of Europe with the colonial world as such. How does that shape? So in that sense, I'm also, so the question that comes from that is, was the popular discourse on economics during the 19th century, or within the academic and university space, in some way engaging with the colonial question, and was there something to do with economics in that? So for example, I've picked up this thing from your book only, where you're talking about a debate, say, between Pigou and Ashley on the tariff question. And and that, of course, kind of speaks to the larger imperial order. So so in that kind of a sense, and also because again you mentioned this in your book as well, and I remember reading an older article of yours on the East India College at Halle, and where the training of Indian civil servants takes place, and the fact that Malthus was appointed the first, was the first professor of political economy, and also interestingly that it's the first chair ever established in Britain on political economy. So, I mean, I'm also just wondering, how does that this economic discourse and through practices that you are writing about and all, does it how might it possibly also kind of play into this? And I maybe even have some other kind of, but they're more, other points are more like comments. So maybe if you wish to, you can first maybe just address this, and we can see if there are other questions, and then I can return with some further comments if we have the time. And all.
Well, thank you. Well, I'll start with your comments. The last thing you were talking about with the Malthus stuff is so that now, interestingly, say in my article I described this is, I mean, that, well, what I should say as well is that piece started life in the mid 1980s, because I was at that time involved with this Van Hont on the institutionalization project. And we were working on the British side. I was part of the British and the German camps in that. It was a big international project coordinated from Cambridge, mainly by Istvan, which had national workshops, and so it was basically Europe, Japan, and America were the kind of touchstones of that. We were coming up to a meeting in Paris, which was the first time we would meet. I think various European countries were going to meet, and so I drafted a piece on. I was going to write a piece on Malthus and East India College, but I drafted that piece in order to give an idea of what sort of thing we wanted people to, as a model really for the sort of treatment we wanted. And so what I do is it becomes a history of the institution. And of course, there's the interesting thing about, and there's actually a mistake in that, which is relevant as well. That East India College in Britain was created as a response to the creation of a college in India for training civil servants, especially training them in languages. Basically, and this was done by, I forgot what his first name was, Wellesley, and it was the East India Company became very concerned about this because A, they didn't control what was going on, and B, it was costing a lot of money, and so they were very concerned that this was happening. So the point is that the East India College in Britain, starting 1805, which became in Haileybury, which is now a public school in the same buildings. This was a kind of answer to this Indian institution. And the mistake is that, which is sort of irrelevant historically in terms of research, is that I mistakenly called this person Arthur Wellesley, i.e. the later Duke of Wellington. And I was very puzzled that but actually it was his brother. And the reason why this elementary mistake could be made was the only way I could check up on this in my notes was by going to the library and looking in the Dictionary of National Biography, which would take time. Whereas today, I could do that in half a minute just by looking on Wikipedia, that you just so that a lot of the early work of mine was putting together things. So that this mistake arises out of a feature of the kind of work I was doing in the 1980s, and the fact that you had to go to places physically and look at papers. Like I did all the work on the East India College in what was then the India Office Library, which has now been moved to the British Library. So anyway, that's the first point, that actually there was this interesting history And actually, there's an interesting later history to the institution as well, because basically the events of the later 1850s led to the demise of, well, basically to the kind of transition of the East India Company to the Indian Civil Service, and then the demise of East India College as the validating institution, as it were, for Indian civil servants. And then there was a problem about who could become an Indian civil servant. And so you have all these things, because it was about language. So one of the more ironic aspects of it was, of course, that it was people from India who had the language skills that were quite important for all of this. But they were, the Indian Civil Service was quite reluctant to simply, open a pathway for Indians to become Indian civil servants, and so there was a lot of toing and froing, arguing about that. But so that's and also what Malthus taught was basically Adam Smith. He taught mainly standard English political economy. The law part of it was more adapted to India, but this wasn't at all adapted to the Indian economy. Basically, they were trained in doctrine, really, or of the principles of political economy or whatever. And so that's an interesting feature of it. So yes, I mean so the history of the India, this kind of history from the late 18th century to the creation of the institution, who's in it and all the arguments that go on in it. I mean, basically what its function was, what they learned. Malthus's title was Political Economy and History, or History and Political Economy, more precisely. And also the fact that Malthus was the appointee, because who else at that time would you have appointed? There were so very few people who had any kind of specialized knowledge of what was becoming. He was contributing at the same time to the rapid development of a new kind of doctrinaire political economy, and so that's all part of that story and its fate. And then, of course, Richard Jones succeeded him when Malthus died in 1874. And Richard Jones himself has an interesting history and all the kind of work that he did and the kind of comparative historical work that he was involved in. And so there's all that kind of work as well. So there's an interesting institutional aspect to all of that, but it didn't survive. But I suppose that the practice of, by the later part, the Indian Civil Service examinations themselves became an important component of Oxford's activity. And so Toynbee himself, when he was appointed as tutor at Balliol, was tutoring students on the Indian Civil Service exams. And so this was also, that was one of the major media through which political economy got taught in Oxford. But turning to your thing about the tariff question, which is, I mean, what's irksome about the tariff question is, yes, it's very important. I mean, this argument between Pigou and Ashley and about really imperial development and trade is really interesting, and there's hardly any literature on it. I mean, I've been reading in the last 2 or 3 years literature on or filling in the gaps, as it were, from the 1970s on study of English agrarian history in the 18th century and early 19th century. And there's absolutely masses of it, And so, there's just so much of it. It's just unbelievable. This tariff question, which resonates still today. I mean, with Brexit and all the arguments about, where you're trading in the world and what your place in the world is, that's all part of the same sort of story. And as far as I can work out, and I've sort of come across, there's just hardly any research on Britain's trading position, arguments about trade, and that in the early 1900s. It's a very crucial issue because I mean, we're reminded of it because when we had the election in July, general election in July in Britain, it was questions whether the Tories were going to lose with have as bigger a defeat as had happened in 1906 in Britain, which was over the tariff question, basically, a liberal imperialism and Tories together and things. And Ashley himself, who set up the commerce degree in Birmingham, was a liberal imperialist. Chamberlain, the mayor of had been the mayor of Birmingham, then in the colonial office, was a liberal imperialist, and the Boer War, which they'd all been associated with, was part of what. I mean, so it's all these things are, but there's no work on. I've never seen any decent work on this at all, really. I mean, well, there's a couple of books, older books about this in part, but there's nothing which stitches these things together that I'm aware of. There's obviously a lot of stuff I don't know about, but you tend to sort of pick up things or find things, you don't completely not notice it. So I think that would be a really interesting area to look at, because the way in which, I mean, just the two books which Edgeworth reviewed both and said that that Pigou and Ashley were the kind of the two polar opposite accounts of cases for imperial preference or free trade and whatever. So that's an interesting question. I mean, thinking of that as well, Ryan Walter and myself have got some general plan to write a more popular book about free trade arguments, and I think the tariff question thing we would actually have to go into that. But even finding what was bizarre, I mean, as a researcher, when I was working on this, actually looking at the controversy in the Times of free trade, the liberal economists who were for free trade, Marshall and his associates, Pigou, and the liberal imperialists who were protectionist, Hewins and Ashley. They were and of course so anyway, just I was thinking of other people. So basically, reading the Times correspondence of this revealed things that I had not read and had not understood from the literature. That in fact there were lots of people who came in later and said, "Oh yes, I agree with Marshall and Pigou and all that lot," who one would assume would be on the protectionist side. So no one had ever seemed to gone through even the correspondence in the Times properly to actually demarcate who it was who lined up on these two sides and what arguments they advanced. So that's part of this kind of, it's a policy issue. And it's also part of where Pigou, I mean, this is pre-war Pigou. Pigou changes really. I mean, he is actually very policy oriented in the 1900s, early 1910s, and that's where his economics of welfare comes from. But then after the First World War, he becomes kind of he becomes a writer, really, more than anything else. His teaching is very, very limited. He plays virtually no role at all in organizing what goes on in Cambridge. So it's his writing, but he's been, I think, not well served by the history of economics community in terms of, and recently there's been more interest in his work. When I did years ago do a lot of work on the various editions of economics of welfare and how that all changed and what he was, but Keynes himself, using him as a punching bag for classical theory of unemployment, or classical theory of employment, in the second chapter of General Theory. That Pigou is a person who is really interesting, and who actually was both a theorist and a practical Marshallian, and he embodies that kind of idea, as was really Keynes. I think. And so they embody this kind of Marshallian tradition, which actually never ended up in sort of in teaching, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. In fact, I also have some other like comments, questions, but I think I'll leave that for later. We have another 2, 3 questions which have been typed out, and interesting that you ended on that point regarding Marshall, because I'll just read out Ruchira's question, which she has in fact typed in the chat box, but I'll just read it out. She's saying that it is interesting that science becomes sanitizing. I guess she's referring to that part from Robbins and onwards. Oh, okay. We have
Wow.
Richard up. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and maybe Keith can answer that, and then we have another couple of questions that we could read out. Yeah.
Okay, Keith, I'm sorry for turning off my camera and all that. We are having a bit of a care crisis here, with my son and failure of daycare and so on. But my question is that it's interesting, you were talking about how science is sanitizing. But is it in the design of these positivistic true and false statements? Or is it that this particular imposition was done deliberately? Because, for instance, you have Strafa, and Strafa has your input output model, but Strafa's input output model is not sanitizing. He has a linear wage regime where when wage share increases, profit share decreases, it changes the prices in a particular way, and when the prices are changed, then there is a flow of value from capital intensive goods to labor intensive goods, thereby, of course, Strafa thinks resolving the transformation problem. But his mathematics is not sanitizing. There is class, there is value, there is distribution. Even Ricardo, for that matter, it is a very political, it's a very political exposition. He's talking about the difference in class between capitalists and rentiers. Later on, Keynes is taking from Ricardo and he's talking about euthanizing rentiers. So all of this is all mathematically backed and positivistic, but it is not necessarily sanitizing. So, I mean, but why is it that we forget Srafa and we forget Ricardo, even like the better part of Ricardo also, I think, but we remember Marshall?
Yes, I mean, well, I think, well, I do talk a bit about Sraffa's critique of Marshall in chapter 6 of the book. But no, he's not. I agree entirely. It is not coming from the point of view of science. That what is coming from was basically his formation is as a Marxist, an Italian Marxist. He's coming from a European tradition of Marxist theory, which had developed in, say, the 1890s. And this is Marxist. This isn't, this is not what Marx is really, in a sense, we're doing. It's a kind of the elaborations on Marx, which follow on through a number of different central writers from the 1890s onwards. And Sraffa sits in this tradition, and so that's, I think, and it has an affiliation with the kind of way of thinking of English political economy, particularly of Ricardo and his associates. But these are quite abstract ideas in a sense. I mean, Marshall is worth remembering, because I remember when I don't know, I haven't been in the Faculty of Economics library in Cambridge for decades now, but when in the 90s I was working on this and I was talking to the librarians, the Marshall Library is relatively small. It's upstairs. And at the end there's a brick wall which must be, I don't know, about 6 or 7 meters wide or something like that. And I was talking to the librarians about Marshall's, about the indexing system I developed when I was working on the Economic Journal, which was kind of generated in an ad hoc way. And I showed this to them, and they said, "Oh, this is like Marshall's system for his pamphlets." And they pointed to this shelf which went right across the back wall, and was all the things that he had torn out of, or pamphlets he had kept from stuff he had read. He'd assembled this enormous amount of practical literature, and he'd indexed it so he could find material in it. And that's obviously what went into his industry and trade and money, banking and commerce. So Marshall is a different kind of, he has a different kind of grasp of economic activity. But where the thing about the sanitizing science thing is that Robbins, who I associate with this, is coming from a different point. That actually Susan Howson in her biography does identify some interest he shows from the early 1920s in the philosophy of science. But as I say also in the book, that if you flick through American and British journals of the 1920s, yeah, they'll talk about science, but they don't. It's just a kind of generalized statement. It's never. Frank Knight has got a chapter which talks about science and being a risk, uncertainty of profit, but it's not a big demarcation device particularly. And it is very curious the way that if you read the inaugural lecture of Robbins, I mean, it's a shocking piece of work, really, because my point about Robbins is he knows no statistics, he knows little maths, he has very little practical economic knowledge. He doesn't know as much continental economics as he would like people to think, and you can demonstrate that by simply in two ways: what the references he gives to his students in the LSE calendar. So, for example, he refers his students in one course to a text in German, which is on the history of economics, which was never a book at that time. It was actually part of, so this is 1929-30. It's part of the 1914 Grundriss, the outline of economics. It actually is what I point out in the footnote is if you put this reference into the Bavarian State Library system. The Bavarian State Library is basically the most elaborated digitized university or library in Germany. It tells you, oh, it gives you the book. It's a Japanese translation of the 1950s as an English translation. This book was not a book then. This reference was there to impress his students. It wasn't something they could read. French work that he refers to is, he refers to the wrong volume or the wrong chapter, as far as you can work out. Fetter, when he refers to Fetter, he's referring to a part, not a chapter, really, when he's talking about it. And so he's not as au fait with this. And from my own role as a translator, what I immediately noticed was that he mistranscribed German titles of texts that he made. The mistranscriptions were to do with the fact that in German, nouns all have capital letters, and that is maintained through book titles, unlike in English book titles. And he made elementary mistakes in transcribing these titles. And there were things like in Nature and Significance, where he's copying things in that he obviously hasn't read, because he makes mistakes in the things. So the point about Robbins was that he was a showman in a sense, and he used science instrumentally to kind of say what I'm talking about is so difficult for you to understand. And this inaugural lecture is terrible. It's terrible. He talks about the people in Lausanne, i.e. talking about Walras, but he doesn't talk about what Walras is doing or talk about general equilibrium theory, because as far as I can work at that time, he doesn't know very much about general equilibrium theory at all. And so this is you know, that's the, so this whole system gets set up as an esoteric knowledge, and then the way it's taught and the diagrams are purely illustrative. You know, there's no data behind them. There's not even any mathematics behind his diagrams. They're just sort of pictures of things. But this is what then becomes, you know, economics 101, effectively. I mean, if you look at Marshall's principles, all the diagrams are in footnotes. The maths is in the appendix, all the diagrams are in footnotes. They're not central to it. But Robbins obviously ended up with this kind of way of, he rehearsed his lectures. He gave his lectures without notes because he'd written them out beforehand and memorized them. Marshall rambled. Everyone said Marshall rambled, but they said it was always interesting because he was talking about things and things that struck him. And Marshall had lots of slips of quotations, and he would take those with him. And he would, when something struck him, he would find the right quotation to fit what he would be talking about, you know. So these are different styles of doing economics, effectively. Straffer is one style, I think, coming out of the Marxist tradition of theory, and Marshall coming out of the maths tradition of analysis and having tools which you can use, a toolbox you need tools to understand this. And Robbins is this person who's, in a sense, using the increasing academicization of things as a way of blocking out popular knowledge. That this is something which not anyone can learn. You have to have qualifications and all the rest of it. And that's the thing I think is important.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Keith. I think, I mean, we can maybe, I know I think we've gone over time in general, but if you do have some time on hand, we can maybe even add in a couple more questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm not doing anything.
Right. So, just reading out some of these questions. Carlos Rivera is asking, so he's saying, thank you for the talk, Keith. Very interesting. As someone working on 19th century France, I was wondering, you mentioned the importance of understanding economic discourse through practices and the importance of the modern university for contemporary economic discourse. Taking that into account, what would you say is characteristic of 19th century economic discourse that is different from contemporary economic discourse?
Yeah, well, so I'll just kind of move that across. Just think, yeah, so I don't know, minimize. Yeah, so 19th century France, I mean, is an interesting case. So I'm just refresh my mind. I can't perhaps yeah, it's modern. Well, what if we think about 19th century France? I mean, a lot of the teaching of political economy, économie politique, is sort of public lectures and things. I mean, it's not, there isn't, as I say, there isn't a qualification as such. There are commercial colleges, which I talk about, but there isn't a kind of system of teaching. I mean, I did do some work on the 1930s in France, where there are sort of lectures and whatever, but there was no system for training economists per se, which happened very quickly, I think, in the 1940s. And really what, I mean, and as I say, I think in passing, I mean, the French did have an economic sort of the Journal des Économistes, which started life in the 1840s, and there was this popular, well, it's sort of a weekly or monthly. I mean, it came out as very frequent. I mean, a publication in which all sorts of people could talk about or write about economics. And this is, in a sense, where Léon Valras came from in the first place. He was, as a journalist. So there was a kind of tradition of economic journalism, which people could also, you could get lectures published as well and have all kinds of things. And so you've got a thing called économie politique, where you have big books written in the tradition of Say, and coming out that. You've also got incredibly sort of diffuse arguments about economics, which and all the arguments as well coming out of the Saint-Simonian tradition as well from the 1820s, 1830s, like Léon Valras's father, Auguste. So it's a very dispersed and diffused kind of knowledge, and so that's and at different sorts of levels. And there's no, at that time, there's no, as it were, master discourse which is discriminating between these. There are all sorts of different people having different kinds of discussions in the same sort of way that happened in Britain, but not in the same kind of way. Now, so if I'm sort of riffing on this, thinking of comparison.
Germany, there are all these academic there are all these academic posts of people who are in the university system who are academics. Their main public forum, their main is the Verein für Sozialpolitik, which is created in 1872, and which by the 1890s is a forum for recommending to the government or doing surveys on behalf of the government into social problems. And so this is the main activity about which the public activity, the annual meetings they have. This is the main activity which they're concerned about, not about theoretical issues per se. And so there are these things that the sort of theoretical arguments don't actually have any kind of master discourse hold. Whereas in modern economics, and this actually also, I suppose you can take it within the bells. I mean, the graph that I appended to the notes is interesting in this respect, is that there is a kind of privileging of kind of theoretical economics. Now, there's a question about environmental economics, about which I don't know a lot about, which I don't know a great deal, but it's a kind of, it's the generalizing arguments, apart from people like Angus Deaton, for example, and the sort of work that he's been doing on poverty in the United States, and those kinds of, there are those kinds of people, but really my feeling is that the greatest prestige in modern economics goes along with technique, technicality, and forms of theory. And what's interesting about that, the graph, when you have this kind of great divergence, that in fact there's a concentration, there's lack of diversity in the backgrounds of Nobel Prize winners or other prize winners in economics, compared with physical science and engineering, which is fairly diverse, is that in a sense, anyone anywhere can become a physical scientist or an engineer, and if they're gifted in one way or another, can learn the material. But that isn't the case with economics. That actually what happens is that the people who excel or do well in internationally in economics actually come from what's the top 8 universities, which in this NBR paper turn out to be the top American universities. There's nowhere else in the world which counts with this kind of concentration. And so I think that kind of hierarchization of knowledge, which we now have, where it's demonstrable that it's American institutions which, by whatever metric you care to choose, have the leading positions and the big big economists and the big stars and all this stuff. And there was a ranking of international institutions on this basis of the kind that I don't think. I mean, obviously, with things like medical science or certain aspects of physical sciences, you need lots of kit and lots of funding and all this sort of thing. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of how you learn and you start learning about physics and chemistry and engineering, you know, that's, you know, as long as you're mathematically proficient and got that kind of analytical mind, you have a chance of contributing to this very large discourse. And the other thing that in that which is misleading a bit in that graphic is, of course, the world of physicists is huge, much bigger than the world of economists. You know, there are so many more physicists around the world, so many more engineers around the world, so many more people in biomedical sciences around the world than there are in economics. And so it's a network effect where there's a strict hierarchy of what counts as a good argument is more to do with the prestige of the institution it comes from. And in fact, this was also, and I think of it, is confirmed by the studies that the Americans have done on graduate institutions and the way in which, you know, what these graduate institutions teach and who goes where and what counts as a prestigious background. So it's a, you know, in a sense, I mean, that you can see functioning there. In a sense, it's not what you know, it's who you know in economics, which is important in the sense of it's important where you studied, more than how good you are at what you do, which differentiates that off. But that's a kind of style of hierarchization which I just don't think existed in the later 19th century. So that's a sort of response to all of that.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Keith, for that as well, for that response. There is one question we have from Manoranjan Ghosh, but what I do, I mean, I'll read out that question, but what I'll do is I'll kind of use my authority as the moderator here, and I'll instead first prioritize some of my questions and comments before, but I'll read out Manoranjan's question as well. After which I'll mention my comments and questions, and then of course accordingly, Keith, you can decide to respond, and I think with that we can kind of also call an end to the overall discussion. So Manoranjan's question says, could you please tell us a little bit about environmental economic thought in economics? So I know while that's not precisely the focus of today's talk, but Keith, if you would wish to even comment about that later, it would be appreciated by the person who's also asked the question. And but what I have are two broader points here. And I'd like to maybe see what you would think about this. Now, as you're saying, it's interesting, like if you're saying Lionel Robbins, as you're using Robbins as kind of formulation as majorly like the scientization of economics. And it's largely in the sense of saying that it becomes more inaccessible, you know, to sort of say to popular understanding, I would, is what I can make of it. But I'm also seeing, of course, the 1930s and all is also, of course, the time when you have really kind of Keynesian frameworks becoming dominant and all. And I see from my own kind of work and my own kind of study, of course, I see a major parallel in a sense, the emergence of the idea of the expert, if we would say. And over here, of course, I'm referring to, say, the work of Timothy Mitchell and how he's talking about the fact that, I mean, his argument being that it's from the 1930s onwards, really, that people, that scholars begin to identify the specific studyable, quantifiable object known as the economy, which is not necessarily the case prior to that. And so it's interesting, in a sense, the correspondence roughly, you know, I mean, time-wise as well, that's happening. And the same kind of point on that, the greater technical content of economics, more maths coming into it, the waning of the ethical, moral, social, historical questions within a larger economic analysis, or at least a more dominant economic analysis. And of course, this point is not novel to me only. I mean, many others have written about this. So this domain of what we call expertise versus what maybe Robbins, I mean, so I'm interested to also know how is it that, you know, you've looked at Robbins specifically here for this particular kind of way of constructing, you know, the scientization of economics. That's one thing. The other kind of point that I was thinking about is, since I work on it myself also, that there's always a process through which textbooks are written, and textbooks are very instrumental towards how disciplines get really institutionalized and consolidation. It's actually, textbooks also kind of lead to a consolidation of certain principles around any discipline, and say in this case even economics. So I don't know about and I know you have written about this in that book edited by Aguelo and Guidi, right? So so in that sense, how is it that is there a major role of textbooks also in kind of stereotyping or certain, or, you know, entrenching certain doctrinaire ideas, you know, and that become kind of commonsensical in that sense? And say also, because for, again, coming from the Indian context, and again, when you're looking at colonial India especially, there was this huge there was a kind of like a tussle going on in that sense, to say that how is it that economic thought or the right kind of economic thinking in India has coming down from both the British educators, those who were teaching political economy, and also coming from the administrators, has become crystallized down to essentially talking about laissez-faire or free trade policies and all. And of course, this is an argument that has been given by S.M.B. Rajan in his book on classical political economy and British policy in India. So this kind of sense of even so first, of course, is that idea that the expert, and is that something that we can also correspond to what you're talking about, a scientization of economics through Robbins, and something about this process of textbook writing, and how is it and then if you have the time, if you could also answer Manoranjan's question on evolution of ecological economics.
Well, first of all, can you hear me properly? Because my machine, because while about 5 minutes ago, I got a sign that it was going to analog, and for some reason it switched out of my headphones. So you're quite faint, and so that's why I'm so I've been trying to. Yeah. But you asked two questions about Robbins and the scientization thing. One of the things in my book, The Economy of the Word, I look at the development of the idea of GDP, and do it in Britain. I mean, because national income accounting is a British invention up to the 1941 budget, and saying, look, when in 1936, when Robbins publishes his general theory, all of the variables which virtually all of the variables which he uses, independent variables, are unknowns. I mean, there are things which are measurable, and to some extent there were metrics for various sorts of things. I mean, obviously things like interest rates and what have you, but the things like the thing that I make a point of is, well, how many people are working in a particular industry? It turns out at the time there were 3 different numbers you could find, because the difference. So there's a real problem about which Colin Clark was very involved in, of simply reorganizing. I mean, Colin Clark's approach was to say, if you wanted to know how many postmen there were, you had to go through the British census, looking for the number of people whose occupation was postman and you know, whatever. And so that the issue there is that Keynes actually, in general theory, created a framework which actually you could put numbers to eventually. I mean, and then the fact that the war came along after that, so there's a massive kind of statistical exercise also associated with the war to try and keep track of things, for prices and goods and production and whatever. And so this gave a great boost to simply making this operationalizable, you know, the general theory. But Robbins comes before this. I mean, so in the early 1930s, I mean, he's not actually plugged into the arguments which are going on at that time about national income and all the rest of it. He doesn't play any part in that. But I think we have to remember that of this time, I mean, nobody had any numbers really in the 1930s that could be used. I mean, it was all, and there was lots of debate and argument. And of course, we still argue today about, you know, what does GDP actually mean, and how, whether we ought to have a different measure of, and so forth. But I think this is an interesting kind of thing. So that Keynes managed, because of Keynes' brilliance, I think he managed to kind of riff on these categories and make something of them, even though he didn't have particular concrete ideas, concrete numbers for these things. Whereas Robbins took the approach of abstracting so that you didn't need to know what the numbers were, so that you could talk about relationships in the abstract between these things. You could subsequently build mathematical formulations for things like unemployment and inflation and whatever, but you didn't actually need to know the numbers. You know, you could posit kind of relationships. I mean, sort of like the Laffer curve, you know, which is just somebody's idea, but which has the form of a particular kind of meant to have the form of a particular kind of relationship. And so it's that's the kind of thing that I read. But that's, of course, that makes things very teachable, which comes to your second point, because of a concept I use in the book and used in discussions is the idea of teachability. That in order to reproduce a science, it has to become teachable. Now, and this is a kind of an old, when I was a student, undergraduate student, I had friends who were chemists and physicists. And what struck me about the way that they learned, well, it was a purely, you know, the kind of building block approach, that they would just work from one thing to another. They had to remember all the stuff that they got, because it wasn't that you got this and then you moved on to the next thing. You had to remember where it all came from and keep all that in your head. And so that was a structure of their education. Whereas in economics, there were basic formulations you would learn, but you, in a sense, never had to know where they came from or what they represented. And that was because that was where it became teachable. That you didn't use the kind of the diffuse amount or the huge amount of material or data you might have had. So really, I mean, that is the nature of economics textbooks. In my chapter, the last major chapter of the book, I do talk about the succession of major textbooks which we use, up to including Lipsey's positive economics. I mean, and Lipsey was deeply involved himself in the late 1950s in arguments about the measurement and method in economics, and so introduced in these arguments. So the with Archibald as well, and so that there's a way in which that kind of basic the economic profession is that what's striking about it, the sort of the run-of-the-mill economist, is that they think along tram lines, in a sense, that they've had these tram lines laid down in their undergraduate education, and they just kind of reproduce them in more and more complex terms. Later on, you can make things very complex, but basically underlying this is sort of some very basic tram lines, which I think is different to the way in which, as the way I understand it, electronic engineers or physicists or whatever work altogether. I mean, I think that's a thing. So the basic problem with economics, and this is, you can go back to Ricardo and show this, is this doctrinaire nature of it. It has, and Jean-Baptiste, thinking of this, Jean-Baptiste Say has this intention. This is basically his book in 1803. He's simply trying to make political economy a doctrine, as he says, reduce it. I mean, he has an appendix in the second edition, which has the leading top concepts. And in fact, as I showed as well, this is what Marx read mainly. He didn't read so much Say's book, as read the appendix with all these basic principles at the end and what these economic terms are. And you could just construct arguments using just these basic terms. Once you have the terms, you can just mix and match and put them together, independent of any kind of real world problems, or just apply them to real world problems. So sorry, so far as I could hear what you were saying, that's why I took my headphones off, is that on my machine now, everything's very quiet, that's why I use the headphones. But at the same, so those are my kind of ideas about Robinson Keynes and textbooks, which stimulate by what you say.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Keith. I think we've had already a pretty long session here. So I think we can kind of call an end to the session right now. And I would really like to, and thanks so much, Keith, for joining in here. And and I think this kind of way of thinking about the history of economics is it's so very different, to just like to understand its life within the institution, and just going intricately into literally the teaching, the changing of policies, and what is being read at a time, and how does it change. I think it's a very fascinating kind of way to construct, as you say, how the science developed and all. And I think it's something we need to even have further conversations on, because we also would need to I mean, because I'm still further interested in understanding, how does something get categorized as a science, and really what goes into creating it, and perhaps at a later date, because even in India and all, there were just different ways of saying this is a scientific method versus that, and especially when it comes to, and that's why we call everything the social sciences, right? So it's a very curious term for and something we need to really kind of delve into more. But thanks a lot for all your inputs, for discussing your book, which I would really I would suggest everyone really reads carefully, because there's so much to be understood about the history of economics from there. And yeah, with that, and also thank you to all the participants who joined in today, those who have asked questions and who have stayed on, who also stayed on till the end. And as we mentioned, as Ruchira mentioned in the introduction, we are planning to have 2 more talks in September. 12th September, we'll have Manu Goswami, who will be speaking about J.M. Keynes and kind of the role of the economist also, and in the empire as such. So she had an article on, how crisis economics has kind of played its role in that sense. And on 26 September, we'll have Prathama Banerjee speaking on giving some kind of disciplinary reflections on and how to decolonize economics. And her and she's coming from the position of primarily being a historian of South Asia. So she's going to give, she's, I think, going to delve into the aspect of more 19th century processes, how we begin to think about separate spheres of the polity and economy, and how is it that certain 20th century critiques of ways of economic thinking, and especially the move to and as she says, a move towards a linguistic and cultural turn, and now a return to economic questions in the 21st century. So through that analysis, we're going to, I think, get a very interesting sense of how we can begin to rethink decolonization also of economics. So do join in for those talks as well. And we'll be sharing details and posters soon for these as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. And I think with that, we can call an end to the meeting. Yeah, formally. I think we can end the recording.